This is not Marissa, right? So today we've got a special guest, and what we want to do kind of as we move forward is not just ask questions, but also maybe learn a little bit about how our faith, how the Orthodox faith intersects now with the other faiths. So I thought the most appropriate place to start would be where the roots of Christianity started, and that's in Judaism. So I have as our special guest host today, Rabbi Peter Stein, and he is from the Temple Brith Kodesh. Did I say that correctly?
You got it perfect. Thank you.
Great. I want to thank you for being here. It's great to have somebody else here. We can have a little bit of a dialogue. So that brings me to how are we going to do this tonight? So what we thought we'd do is I want to focus in, because we're in Lent and we're obviously then leading to Pascha, and a lot of what we do has its roots in Judaism. And so I certainly do not want to speak for Judaism, so I thought I would bring an expert. And Rabbi, you're going to speak for the entire Jewish faith, right? Just like I speak for all of Orthodoxy, right?
Absolutely, without a question.
We talked about that. So obviously the opinions that we present here are going to be, as I did for North America, and certainly you're not speaking for Israel and everybody, okay? Mm-hmm. So I want to start with that. But I thought maybe what we'll do is, why don't you go ahead and just tell us a little bit about yourself, Rabbi Stein, maybe a little bit about your congregation, and maybe talk a little bit about the different denominations of Judaism so that they can understand kind of where you're coming from.
Sure, and thank you so much for the invitation and for hosting me. It's really, really a delight to be here, and I look forward to our conversation. So, as Father Angelo said, I'm Rabbi Stein. I serve as the senior rabbi at Temple Brith Kodesh, which is on Elmwood Avenue in Brighton. We have a long history that we're very proud of. We're the first synagogue in Western New York. We were founded in 1848, and we are affiliated with the Reformed Jewish movement, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. We're a congregation that is deeply committed to the broader community. So we have a lot of traditions certainly focused on our holy days and our Jewish education and practices, but a lot of what defines us as a congregation is wanting to build relationships beyond our own four walls, mm-hmm. beyond our own congregation, even beyond our own Jewish tradition. And so it's opportunities such as this where I come not only for myself, but on behalf of the congregation to say that we want to continue learning and growing and making our city as strong and as good as possible. And this is a great opportunity for that.
And in fact, I want to mention the way that I met you was through the ecumenical forum that we have. There's a number of us that get together on a monthly basis. I know COVID has kind of put a little damper on that, but so it's not like you're brand new here. We've known each other, I think, since I've been here, and so we have. I think it's yourself. Obviously, the Orthodox Church. We have Stephen Cady.
Leader from, Reverend Cady from Asbury First and Reverend Picken from St. Paul's, the Episcopal Church. Mm-hmm. And then there are others who have been participating different ways. Father Joe Hart from the Catholic Diocese mm-hmm. has been a very active participant in our dialogues. And it's a really wonderful way to sort of grow from friendship to community involvement.
Absolutely, and then they've made me feel very welcome coming here into Rochester.
Just real quick, as a quick reminder, during this first hour, we won't be taking any questions, but during the second hour, we'll be opening the floor to everybody's questions. We'll be only answering a handful. We're not going to be doing this the normal way as they come in due to the time, and I'm sure everybody has a lot of great questions, but please hang on to those questions. In the second hour, we'll be tackling them.
So let me say a little more about Jewish identity in terms of the denominations and the practices. That Jewish history, I always like to begin an explanation by saying, if you look at the 4,000 years of Jewish history, divide that in half.
Okay.
The first half of that history is what we can call biblical Judaism. It is the Judaism that was created and defined by the books of the Hebrew Bible.
Okay.
From creation to Noah and the flood to Abraham and Sarah, on forward from there.
Okay.
The 5 books of Moses, books of the prophets, books of the writings. That era came to an end with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in the year 70.
Okay.
And that first century, of course, was a time of tremendous turmoil and upheaval in lots and lots of different ways. It was the century when Jesus lived. So
Right.
when we look at those two big halves of Jewish history, we talk about biblical Judaism and then the redefinitions that came with the destruction of the temple. And that began what some will call the exile and others will call the diaspora, the dispersion or the scattering of the Jewish people. There was a remnant that remained in the land of Israel, but overwhelmingly that it meant that the Jewish people ended up moving to more and more and more countries of the world. They moved to Babylonia. They moved other places in the Middle East.
Okay.
They continued further afield. They ended up, of course, with population in Greece. They ended up with a population in Spain. They ended up with populations all over the place. And so for many, many centuries, Judaism was what I will call geographically based. You were a Spanish Jew or a French Jew or a Russian Jew, and that defined overwhelmingly what happened, whether it was a matter of ritual practice or whether it was a cultural matter like the foods and the music and the literature.
Okay.
About 300 years ago, that started to shift. There was still a great importance to geography, to that identity as a Russian Jew or German Jew or whatever your country was. But there started to be much more of what I'll call idea-based Judaism, ideological Judaism, that began in Eastern Europe with a movement called Hasidic Judaism, and grew from there into Germany with the founding of what was called Reform Judaism about the year 1810. And then from there, Reform Judaism was created. A response to that was what we call Orthodox Judaism or modern Orthodox Judaism. Conservative Judaism came as well. So I come as a Reform Jew. I'm a member of Reform Judaism. Temple B'rith Kodesh is part of the Reform movement, and that is the oldest of the modern movements.
Okay. All right. All right.
It is certainly a movement that has some very distinct cultural elements. It was founded in Germany, even coming to this country, maintained a certain connection to the German ethos or the German culture, the Protestant ethos in many respects. From there, though, there were a wide variety of practices. So today we dominantly see Reform Judaism, which is a very progressive modern movement. You have Orthodox Judaism, which centers itself on very strict adherence to Jewish law. And then the other practices, other places along the spectrum, Conservative Judaism is a little bit of both. It is very strict in adherence to Jewish law, but also makes a lot of accommodations for modernity.
Okay.
There's another movement called Reconstructionist Judaism, which is also quite progressive, but has a mixed history. And then, of course, beyond all these practices or all these identities, you have what I was mentioning when we were chatting before we came online. The biggest segment of the Jewish community is actually secular Jews, sometimes called cultural Jews. They're not connected to any particular religious practice. They're not members of a
As we would
synagogue.
have secular Christians. Absolutely.
So
right.
it is a very major part of Jewish identity because there are people who are very clear, very proud, even active in their Jewish identity, but it's through culture. It's through foods and literature and art and music and other kinds of practices. It's gatherings with families and friends, but not necessarily connected to the synagogue. So there's synagogue Judaism in its different practices, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. There's secular Judaism, which spans a lot. And then there's still an overlay of geography. So, of course, in today's world, if you look at it in terms of numbers, there are 3 major Jewish populations. There are about an equal number of Jews in the United States and in Israel. And then there's another third, about an equal number, that are spread all over the world. A very significant population in France, populations in other European countries, in lots of other places.
So speaking about, oh, sorry. So speaking about that cultural diversity, and how culture and religion can sometimes get mixed, I think that's one thing that we definitely both share, because Greek culture getting separated from our Orthodox faith a lot of times is very difficult. And now there's another component, I shouldn't say now, but there's another component that's on top of that, is that many of our traditions have a Judaic foundation to them, or have a Judaic base. And so now you've got this other part that you're trying to kind of separate out. So because we're right in this time of Lent, and obviously we're going to be going through Holy Week, and a lot of the events that surrounded what was happening in Jerusalem at that time, I think that many times in the Orthodox faith, we don't understand how to kind of, piece that apart. So maybe what I can start with is, obviously everybody, I shouldn't say obviously, but I'm sure that most people in the audience understand what or who Jesus Christ is to Orthodoxy. Who is Jesus Christ to the Jews?
It's a great question, and probably one of the fundamental ones in a dialogue between religious traditions. As I mentioned earlier, the major dividing point in Jewish history was that first century CE. If you look at the period leading up to there, what we can call biblical or Hebrew Bible tradition, there was a long period of time rooted in the stories that we read in the book of Exodus. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt. They wandered in the desert and ultimately came into the promised land. That puts them about 1200 BCE.
Okay.
And from then forward, they were living in the land of Israel. King Solomon built a temple in Jerusalem in the 900s, early in the 900s.
Okay.
And the Jewish people continued to live in the land of Israel. When the Roman Empire started to establish a presence in the land of Israel, there was intense pressure on the Jewish people of that time. And of course, there were only Jewish people at that time. This was before Christianity had been established in any form, in any practice.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And what we see when we look at this time period is incredible splintering or sectarianism in the population. There were those who believed that the best way we could survive this threat was to be as insular as possible, circle the wagons, shut out any outside influence whatsoever. There were others who said the best way we can survive this time is to embrace this outside culture, to embrace the Romans, to Hellenize and absorb as much of the surrounding culture as possible so that we weren't seen as a threat.
Okay.
There were those who said the best thing we can do is to leave Jerusalem altogether and go off into the country. And that's the population that famously established itself on the mountaintops over the Dead Sea that we know of today through the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found.
Ah, okay.
That was one of the groups that responded. Jesus himself was part of this upheaval. He was one of the group of rabbis. We know that Jesus was a Jew. He lived his entire life as a Jewish person, as a rabbi, as a leader trying to understand how to respond to these grave threats. And with all of this splintering, what resulted in the time period after that, in the, let's say, 100 years after that, was on the Jewish side of the equation, a new definition of Judaism that we can call rabbinic Judaism. Judaism redefined after the time of the Bible. Things that were allowed, things that were now off limits,
Bible
and so on.
Hebrew scripture.
Hebrew scripture,
Okay,
yes.
right.
At the same time that Judaism was creating this rabbinic Judaism, there were other groups, namely the followers of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus, into the next generation, who we can call, from a historical perspective, proto-Christians, and then Christianity to follow that. And the major difference between those two was the theology around Jesus. Jews believing that Jesus was a rabbi, a radical thinker, a revolutionary, someone who urged people to act in the best way possible under terrible circumstances. as opposed to the Christian theology, which said that Jesus was the Christ. Jesus was not just an ordinary flesh and blood human being. So on the one hand, when you have a dialogue between a Jew and a Christian, you can sort of start with the negative. Jews don't believe in Jesus. Jews don't believe that Jesus was or is the Messiah. But I think it's important to understand the common ground, which is Jesus was a very important historical figure. Jesus's thinking and writing, the things that we read in the New Testament, are important historical documents that very well may inform Jews in their thinking, but there's not a theology under it. There's not a religious stance that says Jesus was the Messiah. So then when you jump ahead, what it means is here we are in a world today that I think any of us can agree is deeply broken. We're a world that is very far from peace and equality and justice for all.
Right. Okay.
And so as a person of faith and as a Jew, what I say is I want the world to be perfected. I want a time when every single person is not hungry or vulnerable or afraid or abused or discriminated against. The theological way for me to say that would be I'm waiting for the Messiah to come and the beginning of the Messianic age. I'm not linking that in any way to the historical figure of Jesus. Whereas I think my experience has been that many Christians would articulate the same sort of vision that one day the world will be perfected.
Right.
But it's going to be spoken of theologically through the return of Jesus.
Now, so it sounds like the New Testament is edifying for reading to a Jewish person. There's nothing against reading the New Testament. It sounds like.
So in an academic sense, in a scholarly sense, certainly, yes, the books of the Apocrypha, the books of the New Testament can certainly inform us, but they have no place as scriptures. They're not treated as scriptures. They're not part of our scriptural readings that we do in worship. They're not part of our religious texts that we study. Rather, it'd be the same thing as studying Plato.
Okay. All right. Okay.
We're not going to say a blessing before we read Plato.
Exactly.
But Plato may have wisdom that can guide us or inform us.
So we, as Orthodox Christians, we see our, if I can use the word salvation, we see our salvations in the personhood of Jesus as the Messiah. So maybe another question might be, or maybe a two-part question might be, what is the Jewish definition of a Messiah? And maybe what is it about Jesus that didn't meet that criteria? Is that a fair question?
It's a very interesting question. I like the framing of it. So when Judaism talks about the Messiah, there are really two different ways to articulate it. The classical way, which is most commonly found in Orthodox Judaism, others of the traditional practices, would talk about the Messiah meaning the anointed one that God will send into the world to bring perfection, to bring the conditions of the Garden of Eden into the world today, would be one way that it could be expressed.
And just really quick, and again, remember, Christos is the Greek word or the Greek translation of the Hebrew term anointed. So Christos is that term, so that we get where the Christ comes, Jesus the Christ.
Right, and the distinction would be that the word Mashiach, which is the word Messiah in Hebrew, has that same nuance.
No. Okay.
So when I refer to Jesus, I'm not going to say Jesus Mashiach or Jesus Christ. I'm simply going to say Jesus, or if I want to use some other historical reference.
Okay.
So
All right.
Mashiach, Messiah, the anointed one, is coming from God as a messenger, as the one who's going to initiate this perfect world.
Okay.
There's abundant folklore connecting it in some ways to the figure of Elijah the prophet.
Yes.
And
yes.
I don't know the presence that Elijah has in Orthodoxy. But when you look in the Hebrew Bible at the story of Elijah, what we see is Elijah, like all of the biblical prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, all the biblical prophets, bring their message of justice, how we need to change our ways, how we need to act in the best way. The difference with Elijah compared to all the other prophets is that the description is that Elijah got taken up to heaven in a chariot, which is taken to mean that Elijah didn't die an ordinary human death.
Right, yes.
So Elijah then in folklore becomes this messenger who travels back and forth, and it's some of my favorite reading is these wonderful, colorful stories. Some of them are children's stories, but some of them are very sophisticated, of Elijah making an appearance to sort of remind us of what we're doing right and what we could do better. A classic example would be Elijah appears, in the doorway of a wealthy man dressed in rags, and this wealthy man throws him out, won't give him the time of day. Elijah then reappears dressed in a fine suit, and he brings him in and gives him the feast of the century.
Right.
And then from there, Elijah teaches, you should be generous and welcoming and take care of people regardless of appearance. So an example there. So the Messiah is very much linked to one day Elijah will come and announce or inaugurate the coming of this perfect world.
And just really quickly, there's two particular instances for us in the New Testament when John is baptizing. The Pharisees come, or the Jewish leadership comes and asks, "Are you Elijah?" So that's the first place that we have. And in the second place, in Jesus' transfiguration, where he manifests his divinity from an Orthodox perspective, Elijah and Moses are present. So those are those two examples where we bring Elijah into that's how we treat him. So I just wanted to.
So the other way this evolves is moving from what I'll call the personal Messiah, that the Messiah will come and perfect the world, to the aspiration for what we can call a messianic age.
Okay.
So not that we're waiting for the Messiah to come and perfect the world, but that we have the power to bring the world just to the edge of perfection. And then God will inaugurate eternity, the perfect world, the messianic age. So it really empowers us that we are not simply praying, please God perfect the world, but we need to roll up our sleeves and get busy and do it ourselves.
Right. Okay. So what is it about, how did Jesus not meet these requirements?
Well, I'm not sure of a perfect answer to that question, but I would say that Jesus was one of many, many thinkers or actors of his time who tried to guide the people to good behavior. And from a theological perspective, going back to the prophets, there was nothing that said this person is anything more than a wise person, a person who's telling us important things. I suppose one way to answer it might be, this may sound bad, based on results, that if Jesus was the Messiah, then how come the world wasn't perfected?
Then why was the Messianic age not entered?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another thing I wanted to ask is, Holy Week begins with Jesus's entry into Jerusalem, and we all read, or from an Orthodox perspective, we all read kind of the New Testament account. Because he was coming for the Passover celebration, maybe the first question I want to ask that sometimes is confusing for people is, some Orthodox believe that our Pascha or our Easter cannot come before the Passover. So they connect it to the Passover, but actually it's a calculation. So my question is, how is Passover? Is it also a calculation? It's not a fixed day, correct?
So the Jewish calendar, the first and most important point is that the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar.
Okay.
It is a year that is based on the cycle of the moon. So the new moon, when there's nothing in the sky, is the first of the month. The full moon is the middle of the month. And that's the cycle that we know that, of course, the lunar year is 354 days. So what we have is, we look at the book of Leviticus dominantly. Chapter 23 of Leviticus says, here are the holy days and festivals to be observed during the course of the year.
Okay.
And it establishes them. It establishes Passover, and it establishes the other festivals, and the New Year festival, and so on. And they're each given a date in the calendar. So Passover this is considered the beginning of the year. Even though Rosh Hashanah is the New Year's festival, it's really Passover that in the Bible is called the first month of the year.
Similar to what we would see Pascha, that resurrectional event, yes.
So what we have is that foundation in the Bible that says, when is Passover? Passover is on the full moon in the first month of the year.
Okay, all right.
And everything sort of follows from there.
Is there some spring equinox? Because our formula has a spring equinox thrown in there too.
Yes, so it is linked to the equinox, but it's a little more complex than that, because even though it's a lunar calendar, the observances are meant to be seasonal. In other words, Passover is called in the Bible the spring festival, which means it's supposed to take place in spring.
Okay, right.
So what the rabbis did in creating the observance calendar was they used mathematical and astronomical formulas to create a 19-year cycle. And this goes well beyond, I will confess to the World Wide Web, that I am not a mathematician. On a 19-year cycle, in 7 of those years, there is a leap year, which means in 7 of those years, an extra month is added to the calendar. It actually becomes a 13-month year. And this is where you will see some of the holy days will migrate as much as a couple weeks, but then they bounce back. The biggest contrast is if you look at the Muslim calendar. The Muslim calendar is also a lunar calendar, but there's no fix. There's no sense that things need to stay in a particular season. So, for example, Ramadan can be in the spring, it can be in the summer, it can be in the fall, it can be in the winter.
Okay. All right.
Because there's no leap year built in.
Right.
In the Jewish calendar, and this is why you'll sometimes see a difference between when Passover falls and when Easter falls, and then, of course, Orthodox observance is closer to the Jewish observance because of the lunar calendar.
Okay.
But it's not exact because of this leap year accommodation.
Right. And then those inaccuracies then created this Gregorian calendar versus the Julian calendar.
Right.
But the Jewish calendar is wholly different from that.
Exactly. And
Right.
so, this year, so Passover began Saturday night this past week. The Jewish day, just as an aside, the Jewish day is always sundown to sundown. The day begins at sundown, not at midnight or not at sunrise. That's derived from the story of creation in the beginning of Genesis, where with each day of creation it says there was evening and there was morning one day. There was evening, there was morning the second day. And so the note was, it says evening and morning, therefore the day begins at evening. So the Sabbath is Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. Passover begins at sundown on the quote-unquote first day. And so Passover began Saturday night and Sunday this past week, which was Palm Sunday.
On Western Easter.
On Western Easter. Right. And so Passover will end this weekend, which is Western Easter.
Right.
And which is why you have, you essentially have 3 different calendars. When you look at Catholicism or Protestantism versus the Orthodoxy traditions.
Now we do have that. It does say in our canons that our Pascha cannot happen before Passover, but it's not connected to the Passover date. It's connected to the first full moon after the vernal equinox,
Right.
and then that first Sunday, so on and so forth. So there is somewhere of a similar kind of, this calculation. Now, which then leads me to the question, I grew up that this Last Supper was a Passover meal. And is that true?
So from a historical perspective, it's more accurate to say that the Last Supper was a Passover observance. And what I mean by that is, remember this distinction between biblical Judaism and rabbinic Judaism. So the Bible establishes Passover. The book of Exodus, in describing the events that happened to the Israelites, pauses and says, forevermore you shall have a festival to remember these events.
Yes. Okay.
The book of Leviticus then says, in the first year, in the full moon in the first month of the year, you shall have the Passover festival, feast of unleavened bread with bitter herbs, and telling the story, remembering what happened. That didn't establish the Passover Seder as we know it. That was something that was done by the early rabbis in the decades or in the century after Jesus lived.
Really? So a Seder meal really didn't even exist at that time.
The Seder is very, very much a reflection of the Roman influence and the early rabbis saying, whole new world, right? In the biblical definition, observing Passover meant you would bring the Paschal offering to the temple in Jerusalem, giving it to the Levites, to the priests, who would bring it up into the temple and offer it up as a burnt offering. That was Passover. It's called Passover, Pesach in the Hebrew, similar to Pascha, because the observance meant you were going to the temple with your Paschal offering.
Okay. All right.
That's what Jesus would have lived with, because Jesus lived before the destruction of the temple.
Okay.
With the destruction of the temple, this is where the rabbis, you can imagine, being at that table. Okay, what are we going to do now? The temple is destroyed. There's no more temple. We're not in Jerusalem any longer. How do we observe this biblical commandment that says observe Passover?
Okay.
And they created this very elaborate, really brilliant and insightful observance that we know of as the Passover Seder. The word Seder means order, and it comes from the definitions that the earliest rabbis in the book called the Mishnah said, on the night of Passover, you shall do these different rituals in a particular order. And that includes the unleavened bread, it includes the bitter herb, and so on. It includes taking a roasted bone and saying, we remember that we used to make a burnt offering, but we don't do that any longer.
Okay, all right.
All of those observances of the burnt offerings and the sacrifices ended with the destruction of the temple.
Okay, all right.
So the other thing that's interesting when you compare, if you look at the book of Exodus and the Passover Haggadah, the prayer book that's used at the Passover meal and service, is the focus is dramatically shifted. The book of Exodus, from a literary perspective, is about Moses. Moses is the main character.
Sure.
If you look at the Passover Haggadah from a literary perspective, God is the main character. Because the early rabbis said, we want the focus to be on God, not on any human being, even if that human being is Moses. We don't want Moses to be the object of reverence. And so they totally recast and redefined what it meant to observe Passover, to say this is a time to focus on God performing miracles, God redeeming the people in Egypt, bringing them to Mount Sinai for this moment of revelation.
Right.
And so from a historical or academic perspective, it's an important nuance to say the Last Supper very well may have been Passover, but that meant something very different because of what was in the process of being defined was the observance of Passover as a rabbinic event, not the observance of Passover as the biblical charge, which was bring the offering up to the temple in Jerusalem.
Okay, all right, and that helps because Jesus Christ has the words with what we would call the Ecclesiastes, where he says, "Do this in remembrance of me," and then some people try to connect. Well, the Passover is remembrance, and there really is. These are different events that are happening here, and separated by a span of time also too. So it's
and I think the other piece of it from our sort of modern vantage point is, to me, there's tremendous value in learning about other religious traditions, even drawing close to other religious traditions. In a non-pandemic world, we would have a group of church members and a group of temple members sitting together and building a relationship. But at the same time, I think it is really important to maintain the integrity of each individual tradition, the authenticity, the distinctiveness, the individuality of Judaism versus other religious practices. And so the Passover Seder is a rabbinic Jewish practice. It is different than someone from another religious tradition that also holds the Hebrew Bible as scriptures, saying, I want to do something for Passover, because that's biblical versus rabbinic. And the real lived Judaism today, of course, has the Bible as a foundation, but real lived Judaism today is really about the definitions of the rabbis in the book called the Mishnah, the book called the Talmud, and so on, not about the way it is observed in the Bible.
Now, just very quickly, because you use those two terms, and I want to make sure that my congregation also kind of understands. Maybe a little bit, just a small clarification on Mishnah, Talmud, Torah.
For sure. So the earliest holy books, which we consider to be scriptures, are the three parts of the Hebrew Bible. The 5 books of Moses, called in Hebrew Torah, which literally means teaching. The books of the prophets, and the books of the writings. The books of the prophets include the book of Ezekiel, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Isaiah. The books of the writings most famously include the book of Psalms. And those three parts together, the 5 books of Moses, the writings, and the prophets, are the holy book. They are the scriptures for Judaism.
Similar to what, I mean, it's the same as what we would.
And they are the same books as what many Christians would refer to as the Old Testament. We don't use the term Old Testament because the New Testament books are not part of our scriptural tradition.
So it makes no sense to say.
So we have the 3 parts of the Hebrew Bible, and then after that time period, so the books were completed and canonized by around 300, 350 BCE, and then were lived with all the way through to the destruction in 70. And those early rabbis, the new class of leaders that was created, not the Levites, not the Kohens, not the priests, but these new leaders called rabbis, they started to say, how are we going to define or redefine Judaism? What are the practices that we should follow? What are the rules we should observe? And the first book they wrote to make this definition was the book called the Mishnah. It was written in the land of Israel in the 1st and 2nd century. Remember, this was a time where the population was migrating. So there were 2 population centers by the end of the 2nd century. One in the north of the land of Israel in the Galilee, and the other north of Israel, out of Israel, in Babylonia. 2 major population centers. Each of them took this Mishnah and studied it, argued about it, wrestled with it, asked questions, poked holes, made counter-arguments, and so on and so on. And all of that commentary is referred to in Hebrew as Gemara. And Mishnah plus Gemara is called Talmud. And there are actually 2 Talmuds because, remember, the population was migrating. So the population there's one Mishnah, but the population in the Galilee wrote a Gemara. The population in Babylonia wrote a Gemara, and so 1 + 1 = 2. Mishnah plus Palestinian, or Mishnah plus Galilean Gemara equals the so-called Palestinian Talmud. Mishnah plus Babylonian Gemara equals the Babylonian Talmud. And as a side note, the Babylonian Talmud is by far the more important, more influential, because that was the bigger population with the major leaders of the time. Not that the Palestinian one is unimportant. After the writing kept going, and so after the Hebrew Bible, what in Hebrew is called Tanakh, after the Mishnah and Gemara, the Talmud, there were other writings that were created that are in the general category called midrash. And midrash literally means interpretation.
Okay.
And this is a wide range from a story between the stories or an expansion of a story that's in the Bible to sort of point-by-point commentary to things that are more legalistic. So there's a wide range. And that really is the beginning of a continuous literary tradition, that there are modern midrash that are composed even today. You can argue that the sermons that are delivered by rabbis in synagogues today are midrash. They are continuing that interpretation tradition.
Okay, all right. Now, the other thing, or another question I wanted to kind of tie in here is Jesus not only spoke of fasting, but he also fasted himself.
Mm-hmm.
Was he doing this to establish a new tradition that Christianity would carry over, or is fasting part of the Judaic culture or Judaism?
Fasting is part of the biblical Jewish foundation. So it is something that has been redefined in subsequent generations, but there are biblical roots to fasting. The dominant place where we see it in the Hebrew Bible is in the definition of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement.
Okay.
That one of the things that is done is the quote unquote affliction of the soul, and a piece of that is fasting. So it's a 24-hour fast, sundown to sundown, the entirety of the Day of Atonement, the Day of Repentance, using this as a time of soul searching and reflection. And that was, of course, given greater clarity by the rabbis, but it does have a biblical foundation. There's one other 24-hour fast in Jewish tradition, and that is the holy day on the 9th of the Jewish month of Av, which is the day of commemoration for the destruction of the temple. And on the face of it, it might seem that fasting is done mourning for a tragedy, but fasting is not really a significant part of mourning. Rather, there's a theology behind the destruction of the temple, that it was a reflection of the Jews' failure to observe the commandments. The destruction was a punishment. And so the fasting, in large part, is the same impulse as on Yom Kippur, which is we fast to search our soul and resolve to do better in the future. And there are some other ways that fasting is done later on, but dominantly it is really this idea of fasting is part of afflicting the soul and searching the soul and trying to set off on a better path.
Well, and that's really exactly the purpose of our 40-day Lent. So we extended a little while longer, but everything that you mentioned about Yom Kippur and Atonement is exactly the same type of things that we're doing in terms of soul searching and everything like that. Now, when you say fast, you mean literally fast. I mean, when the Greek Orthodox says fast, we mean abstain from certain foods, but you cannot physically fast for 40 days. But is this an actual...
Yes, so and this gets a little bit into the rabbinic definitions, not just what's written in the Bible, but fasting traditionally includes abstaining from 5 things.
Okay, all right.
Okay? So now I put myself on the spot. I have to remember all 5. So fasting means no food and no drink for the 24 hours.
Okay.
No anointing, no perfumes or oils or what have you.
Okay.
No sexual relations, no marital relations.
Okay.
No wearing of leather. So,
And again, I think it may be the same tie-in that we have because, again, we're not allowed technically to wear leather shoes near the altar because it's an animal product, right?
Exactly.
Okay, similar.
Very similar as far as so that's the idea, is that for the 24 hours of Yom Kippur and for the 24 hours of the 9th of Av, it is no food and no drink. And then the rabbis get into technical definitions of what does that mean? Certainly emphasizing that if there's a medical need, so whether someone has to take medication or someone is nursing or something, if there's a medical condition, if there's a life-threatening condition, then absolutely. But others, yes, it does mean a full and complete 24-hour fast from food and drink and from the other activities. And yes, obviously that's the difference between a fast that goes on for more than 24 hours. That is, it's safe to fast for 24 hours. It's not safe to fast for more.
Well, and that may be kind of a fun question, because when we fast during the 40 days, one of the things that we're allowed to have is any type of crustacean or shellfish. That is totally allowed.
Interesting.
What is the prohibition against shellfish? I never really understood that.
So it is one example of something that is very literally carried from the Bible forward. So in the 5 books of Moses, there are a couple of things that are stated in terms of dietary laws. One is there are certain animals that it says flat out are prohibited. And the dominant ones in that category are shellfish.
Okay.
And animals like pigs.
Okay. All right.
So
the cloven hoof idea, or
exactly.
Okay.
So looking at the chewing the cud and the cloven hoof, and what it amounts to is, beef is fine, chicken is fine, but pork is not. Fish is fine, but shellfish is not. And those it's as literal as can possibly be, because it lists there's a list of specific animals. Probably gets into a whole nother subject in terms of how Orthodox or Christians understand the laws or the commandments of the Hebrew Bible, because I'll state probably the most obvious example, which is the Ten Commandments.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right? Nobody that I know of any Old Testament religion, Jewish, Christian, Orthodox, Muslim, none of them are going to say that the Ten Commandments aren't binding upon us.
Correct. Okay.
But one of the big distinctions between Judaism and Christianity is that the laws of the 5 books of Moses are incumbent upon us as Jews, and many of them are not viewed as in force in Christianity.
Absolutely right.
So
right,
the shellfish is actually a great example, because in Judaism it is, that is one big category of the laws of kosher. The word means proper, things that are foods that are allowed or off limits. Pork, shellfish are the big two, and it's very, very literal. It names the animals specifically. The other category is much more subject to interpretation, because it is rooted in a verse that says, "You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk."
Yes, yeah, I've heard that one. Yep.
And on the face of it, right? What does that mean? I mean, does
what
it literally mean do not take a baby goat and put it in a pot with its mother's milk? Mm-hmm. That's sort of odd. Almost awkward to even say. But the clear interpretation by the rabbis is this is saying to us, don't have milk and meat together. And the rabbis flesh this out very extensively, and it means in any form. So it means don't eat them together, don't cook them together
I see. Okay.
in any way. So that becomes of the dominant in the Jewish practice of kashrut, of the dietary laws. Mm-hmm. There's 2 big categories. Pork and shellfish being off limits. Category number 2 is no mixing of milk and meat and what you eat on your plates, your silverware, your pots and pans, and so on.
Right.
And then there becomes a third, which is sort of a subset, which is there's an additional set of laws around how the kosher animals need to be slaughtered and prepared. Pork is off limits in any form. Beef, if in order to be kosher, not only has to be beef, but also the cow has to be slaughtered by a particular set of laws.
In a real ritualistic fashion. I mean,
exactly.
That's yes. Now, getting back to Jerusalem at the time of Christ, one of the big feast days for us is Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, and Palm Sunday kind of explores that whole thing. The Christians make a big deal about Jesus riding a colt, or more correctly, riding an ass. Is there a Jewish significance to a proclaimed Messiah riding that type of beast?
So it's actually a good example of Jesus living his life as a Jew.
Okay.
Because remember, this was still the era when the temple stood in Jerusalem, which meant that all of the rituals of the year revolved around making pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the temple where the Levites would perform the rituals. And so any of the holy days in the year, Passover being one of the dominant ones, what that would mean is make your way to Jerusalem, to the temple, to participate in these rituals.
Okay.
So from the Jewish perspective, there was nothing, this may be a little bit of an overstatement, but there was nothing notable about a rabbi of that time riding to Jerusalem and ascending the Temple Mount, because everybody was in the process of doing that.
Okay, so there's not really any kind of Jewish connection with that.
There's no theological or religious significance to those parts of
And sometimes the connect, and where I was going with that is sometimes they try to make the connection that in times of war, the king would ride a steed, but in times of peace, he would ride a more lowly animal, like let's say a donkey or something like that. Is there?
As far as I know, there's not
Okay.
a significance there. Yeah.
So the other entrance, and again, not that it's Jerusalem, but the other entrance that I think we share a common tradition is that one of our great feasts is, well, actually two of them, is Jesus's entry into the temple or bringing to the temple by his parents, and then also the Virgin Mary, who we would call the Theotokos, being brought in by her parents. So is there what is the significance of, because obviously it happened at that time. We didn't have a 40-day, we call it 40-day blessing today, but what is the Jewish significance about bringing the child to the temple?
So as far as I know, it really would be linked to the same idea of pilgrimage, that in that time period so King Solomon built the temple in 986 is usually the date that I see. From that time through to Jesus' life in the first century, with the disruption of the Babylonian exile, which lasted from 586 to around 490. So other than that 70, 80, 90-year period, Jewish life revolved around what the Bible instructed us to do.
Okay.
First, of course, was build the temple.
Right.
And then it was, on these prescribed occasions, bring offerings to the temple to the Levites. And so it really is very much tied up in, this was Jewish life of that time period, and the theology of what was the significance of this particular individual. That's where Christianity began to differentiate from the different practices of Judaism, the new definitions of Judaism. So it's where I would say, that there's nothing theological about Jesus in the Jewish view. In Judaism, Jesus was a historical figure, not unimportant, not without wisdom to learn from or be inspired by, but it's not in any way part of the religious tradition, because that was what happened afterwards.
Okay.
So,
but is there a Jewish tradition of bringing the child into the temple? Was that something at the time, disconnected from Jewish?
there were some offerings. There were some offerings that involved, the firstborn son, for example.
Okay. All right.
But again, that would apply equally to every firstborn son. It was not. It wouldn't attract any particular attention.
Any particular attention, right? Okay.
For one child as opposed to another, or one family as opposed to another.
Okay. Now, I know that I've been getting the signal. We're pretty close. So I'm going to ask you one more very important theological question. Why don't you have a beard? Because no Orthodox Christian priest is correct without a beard. I've got to have a long beard, so I get a lot of commentary. So
Great question. So the only Jewish tradition that has sort of religious significance around facial hair is, there's a verse in the 5 books of Moses that says, "You shall not touch the corners of your head," and that is understood to mean that you let the sideburns and the sort of corners of your chin, if you're growing a beard, to grow untouched. That's religious significance. Now, there are many cultural Jewish traditions around growing beards and wisdom or stature or things of that nature.
Right.
But it's really just, you'll see in very Orthodox communities that the men will have very long sideburns just because they leave them untouched. And you'll sometimes be able to distinguish it in the corners of the beard, although that normally sort of keeps.
Is that kind of what we would refer to as the Hasidic Jews?
Yes, exactly, the Hasidic Jews. And it's really derived from that biblical verse. That's religiously significant. There are some other traditions. So, for example, when someone is in mourning, if someone's lost an immediate relative, that one of the things that is not done is shaving.
I see.
So,
okay.
I recently lost my mother in beginning of February. And so for the first 30 days, I followed the practice of not shaving and had a pretty full beard at that point. There was nothing that said I couldn't have kept it. And, some of these cultural ideas of, the rabbi's the one with the big beard and, maybe there's veritas attached to it. But for me, it was very much attached to this religious observance of the first mourning period, and my own culture or style or taste or preference.
Right.
There's nothing other than the sideburns. There's nothing that talks about you have to have a beard. Okay.
So it looks like we might have a couple of questions. So again, Rabbi Stein, thank you so much for this. This is a great dialogue. I know myself personally, I've learned a lot of stuff. Some stuff's been cleared up for me. But it sounds like we might have a few questions.
Yes, indeed. Hi, everyone. Even though I am not Rabbi Stein, can I say it that way, or am I butchering it?
Rabbi Stein, that's me.
Yeah, Rabbi Stein. Even though I am not him, I am still here, and I have curated all of your questions as they've been rolling in. And sadly, our internet has been cutting out throughout the day. Demos has put in a lot of hard effort and work into getting that service back up and running.
Have we broadcast any of the show at all?
Yes, a little bit.
Yeah, we've had no internet for the last half hour. It's been off.
Oh, good Lord.
Yeah, and thankfully, our listeners are very patient and understanding of us. Just a few administrative matters. I want to remind everyone that tomorrow we have fish fry, so feel free to get in those orders. I'll remind you all again at the end of the hour, and that tomorrow at 6 is the live stream for the salutation service of the Theotokos. So, this is kind of a bit of a different Orthodoxy questions answered. So yes, I've gone through the chat and kind of picked through the questions based on their relevance to Rabbi Stein being here with us today. And so the first question we have is from Aaron 88205, and he asks, is it okay as an Orthodox Christian to attend a Jewish service? So
the answer to that question is yes. I've attended several services myself. The restriction is that we are not allowed to participate in the service, because then that would indicate then that we are a combined or a joined community. So there's absolutely no problem in an Orthodox Christian going now to a synagogue or to I could be not a temple service necessarily, but a synagogue service. But again, we would just ask that you do not participate in the service out of respect both for the synagogue and then for the Orthodox Christianity part.
Yeah, that well said. The next question also comes from Aaron, and he asks more specifically, what is the Jewish take on the passage in Genesis where God says, "Let us make man in our image"? So, for instance, for us, Aaron claims that it would be the Trinity, but what would Judaism's take be?
Yes, one of the proof texts for us, if I can call it that, is that the use of the plural is one of the passages from which we derive then a Trinitarian formula. Why or what is the significance of the plural for Judaism?
Great, and that clarification really helps with the question. So One way to answer the question is that we would view that verse, we would read that verse as what's commonly called the royal we. That a king or a VIP person may speak in that sort of plural sense of we.
Okay.
I always joke that, if you have a spouse or a partner, it's not going to go very well if you say, "We're hungry, bring me my food." But, you can picture a king or a VIP saying, we are grateful to welcome you to
Yes.
the castle.
Okay.
So the idea behind that verse that says we're created in the divine image it's a very, very important ethic. It's a very important value that says each and every person has a spark of the divine within them, has something holy and beautiful within them, but there's no theology that connects it, as you're describing, to
A Trinitarian.
sort of the proof
doctrine.
text for a Trinitarian. It's really just viewed as I said, what's commonly called the royal we.
Okay.
So,
The next question comes from Matthew Mailu. What are some direct differences between Greek Orthodoxy and Orthodox Judaism, for instance? Could you give a summary bullet list, I think would be...
Well, one, we can start right off the bat from the discussion that we've had. We see Jesus as divine. We define him as God, and you see him more as a historical, and I'm not to put words in your mouth, but
a historical figure, a teacher, a rabbi, potentially, a source of wisdom, but there's no theology, no, not the Messiah, not the Christ, not anything of that nature.
Okay.
So,
And the other difference that I see, but I think that in Reform Judaism, you may be a little bit closer to us. Orthodox Christianity sees themselves not as a legalistic expression of Christianity, but as a spiritual interpretation, meaning that the intent of the law is much more important than the law itself. So that so that mercy and compassion, what in Greek we would call economia, is always extended if the law is going to hurt the person. So maybe in Orthodox Judaism there may be a much more legalistic approach, but I think in talking with you, and you'll express it, Reform Judaism is a little bit different.
yeah, and I think there's some nuance there, because Rabbinic Judaism, after the destruction of the temple, this whole new way of living Jewishly after the end of the biblical era, was very much built on a foundation of law, of how do we understand the commandments, and giving them as much specificity as is needed to observe those commandments. Once you get into the modern practices, you're absolutely right, that Orthodox Judaism emphasizes faithful observance to the law, and any interpretation is going to be legalistic in nature. If you're parsing a law, it's for the sake of understanding it so you can faithfully observe it.
Okay.
Reform Judaism is much more progressive, puts much less emphasis on the legal side, much more on the ethical and cultural side. So there's going to be huge variation in ritual. Obviously, when it comes to ethics, that's going to be across the board.
Okay.
And so I think one of the similarities is that, from what I know of the Greek church and in Judaism, there's a very, very strong cultural identification.
Absolutely, right.
The language, whether it's Hebrew or the other Jewish languages, the music, the art, the culture, the sense
paintings.
of connection. Yeah, absolutely. That is somewhat distinct from the ritual observance and the religious requirements.
Okay.
So, Jesus is one big distinction. Judaism doesn't read the books of the New Testament, whereas, of course, Orthodoxy does. The cultural elements versus the ritual elements, I think it's
Right,
Yeah.
right, and obviously, I think one of the clear similarities is where reading the gospel text is central to our worship service. Reading of the Torah is central to the synagogue service.
Yes.
But you would not have the communion aspect that we have, the drinking of the wine.
Right. There's no communion in Judaism. Our worship consists of prayer and reading of scriptures.
Okay.
And just from one of your earlier comments, one of the things that means is anyone is welcome to come as an observer to a Jewish worship service based on their own beliefs, the guidance from their priests and their religious leaders.
Right.
But I sometimes think of it as, if I go to someone else's birthday party, right? If Father Angelo, if you invite me to your birthday party,
Right.
I'm not expecting to get presents,
Yes.
but I can come in and enjoy a piece of the cake
Absolutely.
as a guest.
Right.
And same thing, we welcome guests, but there are rituals that would only be performed by the Jews.
By the Jews, correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this kind of leads us into another question from Spiro, which is, I think, a question probably many Jewish people get. And I have some commentary I want to provide on this too. Spiro asks, why does Judaism not recognize Jesus as the Son of God? And I think in your discussion, you highlighted pretty well, Judaism's stance on that.
That must have been during the lost time, huh?
Yeah, maybe. But I want to know, personally, what could be a quick response for us Orthodox or other Christians that might be watching this when we hear such a question asked of our Jewish friends? What could we say to kind of step in and explain to fellow Christians the Jewish faith regarding Jesus?
Regarding the personage of Christ?
Yeah, what would be a quick one-liner that we can say to other Christians who might not understand?
Oh, beware of bumper sticker theology, right?
Yeah, sorry.
The elevator speeches, they say. So I think, I don't know if there's a perfect answer, but I think there's two ways to answer that kind of a question. Answer number one is, one line, two-line answer is that when Jews look at the events of Jesus' life, they see them as historical events. They don't understand them in the same way that Christians do, or other believers in Jesus do. Mm-hmm. It's just the events are looked at, assessed, and there's no. I can't say God's not at play, because God's at play
in everything.
Right. But they're not understood as, when we look at the Messiah, the idea is God is sending the Messiah to perfect the world. So in a short answer, it's, Jews don't understand the historical events as messianic. That would be as potentially a short answer. Another way to look at it, though, is I always like to sort of flip that question into a positive, which is, yes, we can say, why don't Jews believe in Jesus as Christ? Or we can say, what do Jews believe? And that's where we can talk about the notion of the Messianic age that Jews very fervently believe lies ahead in the future. That we do believe that there is a better world, a more perfect world coming in the future. If we think of it in terms of death and what happens to the soul, there's lots of ways to link in that. But to me, it's the answer is, it's just not what we believe,
okay.
Right? Mm-hmm. But I think there are ways to talk, turning it around. So,
lovely response. Kivika asks a question. I hope I am saying your name correctly. I am not familiar with Cyrillic script. Trying to do context clues with what I know from Greek. But they ask a question that might be related in some fashion to this response regarding Jesus. But what is the conceptualization, in short, of Mary in Judaism? Is she worshipped? Is she considered holy?
No. So again, Mary would be part of the historical narrative. It's not something that enters into our theology. So if we think of what does it mean that something is considered holy in Judaism? There's the three parts of the Hebrew Bible, and the stance was that was sealed, it was canonized.
Okay.
And that's it. Nothing else was considered to be holy in the same sense afterwards. The nuance, though, is the early rabbis, when they were writing the Mishnah, which we talked about before, and when they were writing the Talmud, their very fervent, earnest intent was to only capture what they understood as God's will. So there are a lot of personalities in the Talmud, but it's not about them. It is their genuine attempt to say, we're the best minds of our generation and the most faithful souls of our generation. This is what we understand God wants us to do in this world turned upside down. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to Jesus or Mary or any other piece of what we find captured in the New Testament, the literary answer is anything after the time of the Hebrew Bible is not captured as religious scripture.
Okay. And again, maybe correct me here, but sometimes the way that I hear it expressed, and I've heard this at our seminary, is that for Judaism, then the Torah was the final covenant, mm-hmm. but we see Christ as now the final covenant. God's message in Christianity, God's final covenant with his people is the sending of his son for the salvation. Mm-hmm. But in Judaism, the final covenant is the Torah.
Exactly.
Can we state that?
I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
Is the things that are described in the Torah are the entirety of what we need to live our lives from a religious perspective.
Okay. All right. Okay.
The next question or statement comes from advocate Sheba Jacob, who is currently in India, and they want to announce that it is currently Good Friday where they are. It's about 5 a.m. And I guess for many other Christians who are non-Orthodox, tomorrow will be their Good Friday. Yes. Here, as a reminder for us Orthodox, our Good Friday is on April 30th. This has me inspired to ask, could you think of Passover as an equivalent of Good Friday? Are they related in some sort of way? How are these, like the timing of these holidays, are they related in some sort of way?
I personally would say that they are not related. I mean, Good Friday celebrates. I mean, I hate to use the term celebrate, but Good Friday celebrates now the fact that he has been crucified, he has been taken off the cross, and now the Friday service is his eulogy, is Christ's mm-hmm. eulogy. So when we use the term Passover there, it's not. I think that they're totally separate.
I would agree, and I would broaden it a little bit and say, to me, it's about the difference between a historical event and a religious observance. That Passover, on the one hand, is commemorating the historical event of the Israelites going free from Egyptian slavery, the miracles that we read about in Exodus, the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, and so on. But Passover as a religious observance is not really about that historical event so much as it is about using ritual to focus our attention on God as a redeeming power. And yes, of course, you can't escape the historical story. That's a major thing that we do is we tell that story. But when we, for example, as the person asked, talk about the relationship between Good Friday and Passover.
Okay.
They're two totally distinct, separate religious observances. One right. in Christianity and Orthodoxy, and one in Judaism. Mm-hmm. Okay. And actually, it occurs to me that another piece of articulating that would be the difference between Good Friday tomorrow and Good Friday on April 30th. If they're historical events, how could they be
separate? Right, yeah.
Right? It's because they're ritual observances.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay.
Well, there's another correlation. Every year on Easter, some channel on TV plays the Ten Commandments.
And we love that too.
Great movie.
I'm really going to be disappointed if I get to heaven and Moses doesn't look like Charlton Heston.
I
I'm really
know.
going to be disappointed,
And
right?
it's actually, so if you watch, I love the Ten Commandments, one of my favorites. If you watch the movie all the way to the end and watch the credits, it actually goes into great detail about I mentioned the word midrash before.
Yes.
About the Jewish texts that they consulted in the making of the movie.
Okay.
It is very faithful to not just the book of Exodus, but to some of the Jewish commentaries and teachings that were created later on. So,
so it does follow pretty well then. Oh,
yes,
very good.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. There's that famous scene in the movie where, as they're beginning to leave Egypt, they take the coffin with Joseph's remains in it. Read the end of the book of Genesis, and it says that Joseph said, when the time comes, when you're able, don't let me stay here, bring me back to the land of Israel. And the Midrash takes note in Exodus that yes, when they were escaping from Egypt, they did exactly that. The rest is Sisa Mil. It's the imagination of what it looked like.
Sure, right.
Very much it is rooted in the biblical text and in the Jewish commentaries.
Charlton Heston, the one man that can play Moses and God.
That's right.
He played God in a Paul Hogan movie called Almost an Angel.
Oh, okay.
Well, moving on to the next question. I really like this one. It's from Oristus. How would Jesus instruct a devout Greek Orthodox person and a devout Jew to understand and accept one another's equally strong faiths while feeling that our own are valid? It's hard to put Jesus's words,
Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily want to,
But how would you, each of you, instruct, someone of your own faith to accept one another's strong faiths equally while considering that each other's is valid?
I mean, to some extent, we are going to have to agree to disagree. I mean, there is a chasm in our two faiths. I mean, we can't deny that for sure. Okay, but what I was hoping to present today is that there are very significant similarities, and much of what we do has a very Judaic foundation from which it comes from. Now, at some point, we have to say, I'm sorry, but I don't believe that on either side. I mean,
Yeah.
we have to say that.
I would build on it in this way. I'm not sure it's directly answering the question, but as a rabbi, as a leader of the Jewish community, what I would say is to my people, to the Jewish community, number one, be faithful in your own religious beliefs, the authenticity and the importance of Jewish belief and practice. Number two, it's a commendable thing to celebrate other people who are faithful, other religious traditions. And number three, there's a very important Jewish, call it a principle or a value, that we are not interested in proselytizing. We are not interested in encouraging someone to convert. So it's not for me as a Jew to say to you, you really should not believe in Jesus. Come to my way of thinking.
Right.
There is conversion that is accepted in Judaism if someone comes, but there are a number of steps to make sure that person is sincere and doing it of their own.
Okay.
There's a strong stance that we are not to go out and encourage it. We believe what we believe, others believe what they believe, and that's
And in the end, and both of us, I think, would agree, God is God, right? And
Yes.
and so we can't speak. Certainly, the Orthodox would never speak the mind of God. So all we can do is, and I absolutely agree with what you said. Live your faith to what it means. Now, the Orthodox and possibly Judaism, and I'll see what your answer to this one is, where the Orthodox would have an issue is with a person who now puts their feet into both faiths. And our passage specifically there is that God will spit out the lukewarm. I mean, either you're here or you're there. I mean,
Absolutely no. Judaism is very clear. I think every religion that I know of is very clear that it is inappropriate to blend traditions together. And part of Jewish history is there's a tragic history of persecution, of anti-Semitism. And so there is, in many Jewish communities, there's, sort of a rough edge that's been built up that says we have to be careful about these surrounding people because they may not treat us well. But I think, we live in a wonderful time, even though there is still anti-Semitism and discrimination. There's an incredible amount of acceptance and integration, which is a beautiful and commendable thing. But the hard stop would be you can't blend these traditions together. I suppose there's some debatable points, but I can come into this beautiful sanctuary. I can enjoy the holiness of the space. I can enjoy the hospitality of you who have welcomed me.
right.
But in no way am I going to then turn this into part of my Judaism.
Right.
Same thing in reverse. And it's a matter of if I use the American image, we sometimes talk about the melting pot of America. I think the better image is not a melting pot, but a salad bowl, which means you're maintaining everybody's uniqueness, everybody's distinctiveness, but you're celebrating the fact that you're all
That we
living
can gather together like
Yes.
this. Right.
We're not trying to melt ourselves down into an indistinguishable
Right.
kumbaya
Yeah, exactly.
kind of.
Thank you.
And in here, the salad bowl will clearly be a Greek salad.
It will be a
Absolutely.
And
One
then
of my
there'd
favorites.
be another argument about who makes baklava better, right? Okay, so
Oh boy. A related question to this really illuminating discussion comes from Matthew Scarf. How do I tell my family that I want to convert to Judaism? And a related question that I have is, what about, because I agree about the salad bowl image. I remember in high school we had a debate on whether things would be a melting pot or a salad bowl with the description of America. But this has me asking now, relevant here, what about blended families? So what if you have, say, a husband who is Jewish and a Greek Orthodox wife together and the raising of their children? They want to have their children exposed to both faiths. Is that not okay? But to Matt's question of how do I talk to my family about wanting to convert?
So the conversion question, I'm going to leave totally to you, Rabbi. But and we talked a little bit about this, but the Orthodox faith does not allow for an interfaith marriage. They allow an inter-Christian marriage, but because of the difficulties in the chasm that we just spoke about, the Orthodox feel that it would be much too difficult to have an interfaith marriage, so I am not allowed to celebrate that. In Reform in Reform Judaism, that there is a possibility there. So maybe a question is, how do you see that couple who is interfaith?
So there's two parts. I would let me address the conversion question first, because I think it's a very important and sensitive question, and I'm glad that you were able to share it in this forum. Anyone who wants to convert to Judaism should speak directly with a rabbi. It's not something that can be done through online classes or checking books out of the library. I'm not minimizing those kinds of personal learning, but it is a very intensive and very personalized process done under the guidance of a rabbi. And in terms of the family dynamic, I know when I meet with people, and I'm confident of my colleagues as well, that one of the first things we would say is we would never want conversion to be something that breaks apart a family
Absolutely.
or becomes a problem in a family. And so we would sort of have important conversations about what's your motivation? Why are you interested? And then from that, how would you explain that to family? And it may be a matter of family coming in together. It may be a matter of practicing a script. It may be a matter of involving a family counselor. But to me, anytime someone comes to me for the purpose of conversion, one of the first things we talk about is it's not just what you're converting to, it's what you're converting from.
Okay.
And so if someone comes and says, I'm coming from a Greek Orthodox family, how can I tell them that I'm interested in conversion? We would sort of have to play out different scripts, different ways of expressing that, with the ultimate goal that it keeps that birth family, that family of origin, whole and intact.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The other piece of it is, yes, there's going to be a big difference across the Jewish spectrum, from Orthodox Judaism to Reform Judaism and so on. Orthodox Judaism is very definitely opposed to marriage that is not between two Jews. Any intermarriage between a
What we
Jew
would
and
call an interfaith
an
marriage.
interfaith marriage, or between a Jew and someone of no faith at all, or Orthodox Judaism, there's no question, would really oppose that. Reform Judaism, I'm very proud of our progressive identity, and a part of that is we work very, very hard on inclusion. And inclusion, it covers a wide spectrum. So inclusion would be of LGBTQ individuals. Inclusion would be of those with different abilities, whether they're physical abilities, developmental disabilities, and so on. And would also include those of mixed heritage, mixed backgrounds. So we have many members of our congregation where the one person is Jewish and the other person is sometimes practicing another faith, sometimes not practicing the faith, sometimes lapsed in their religious practice. And it's still a nuanced and complex thing, and
Sure.
there's still a lot of emotion, and I'm not going to say that it's completely celebrated across the Reformed Jewish community, but I'm very proud of our commitment to inclusion, and a lot of that comes to things like, yes, we fully include interfaith couples and families in our congregation. The hardest part, I think, another piece of the question was when it comes to things like raising children.
Yes. Yeah, that's,
That very firmly, I believe that you can't be two things at once. So if a Jew marries a non-Jew, there are ways to celebrate that union, there are ways to embrace them as a couple, but there are very hard and important conversations that have to be had about how they raise the children. What kind of education do they have? What kind of religious rituals do they have? And so on. And again, it always comes back to it's deep, personal, open and honest conversation. So it's not that things are encouraged, rather they are embraced. And it's one of the big distinctions between progressive Judaism and Orthodox Judaism.
okay.
But because this is a question that we get a lot, I'm just very curious, especially since you just spoke about inclusion. We still have a few limitations in the Greek Orthodox Church as far as gay marriages or who can be a priest. Are there the same limitations in the marriages and the rabbiship?
So all night long I've been talking about Orthodox Judaism, and the truth is Orthodox Judaism is really a range. So there are modern Orthodox, there are ultra Orthodox, there are Hasidic Orthodox. There really is a range. Reform Judaism and conservative Judaism and Reconstructionist Judaism fully and completely embrace and include whether it's same-sex marriage or others like you're describing. Ordination of men and women equally, ordination of gay individuals, transgender individuals, all of that is completely accepted as a very important justice principle within Reform Judaism. In Orthodoxy, there's going to be a little bit of a spectrum. There's still going to be some of the older prohibitions, certainly when it comes to things like marriage. Modern Orthodoxy is starting to see a move towards ordination for women,
Okay. Wow.
which is, still not fully formed, but is happening in some very exciting ways. So it's again, I can never talk for all of Judaism. And this is a case where, it's one of my very proud commitments that if a gay couple comes to me for marriage, absolutely. There is no reason. I mean, there might be other reasons why I'm not able to do the wedding, but that would certainly, we have gay couples who have been married in the temple by the rabbis and so on. So.
Our next question comes from On Petard. In Judaism, what is the nature of the coming Messiah? Is he or she to be normally born human, or are they supernatural, divine in entity?
So the Messianic thought is largely that this is going to be a being that comes directly from God. It's not going to be a flesh and blood
Okay.
ordinary human being.
Okay.
There is a mystical concept that at any moment in time, the number 18 in Judaism is of great significance.
18.
18.
Okay.
And then multiples of 18. So there's a mystical tradition that says at any moment in time, there are 36, so 2 times 18, 36 truly righteous individuals in the world. And they're not the Messiah,
Right.
but the idea is if these people can have their influence, that could help bring us to the Messianic age.
Okay. All right. All right. Somewhere, and again, I don't know if it's urban legend or whatever, but somebody had told me one time that that if every Jew obeys the Torah for one day, this will. Have you ever heard
So
of?
from the legalistic or commandment-oriented perspective, generally speaking, it's the more Orthodox Jews who are really focused on the coming of the Messiah. Progressive Jews will talk much more about the Messianic age.
Okay.
But the Jews who are more driven by Messianic vision will link it together as Orthodox Jews to faithfulness and observance of the commandments. And it's exactly what you were saying, which is the idea is that if the commandments are observed, that's going to perfect the world. And so, yes, there's this idea that
Okay.
if every Jew follows the commandments, that's going to prompt the coming of the Messiah. And so it's why you'll see some ultra-Orthodox Jews who are even out in the public arena being very, trying to encourage Jews to more observance of the commandments.
I see. Yes.
I may talk about, it's fulfilling, it's meaningful, it's gonna help you. An Orthodox Jew is much more likely to talk about the idea that it's their mission as people focused on this Messianic vision if people follow the commandments, that will prompt the coming of the Messiah.
This is more of a statement. Pandora says, many thanks to Rabbi Stein for coming and sharing his progressive thoughts. I look forward to the full interview. Have a blessed Passover, Rabbi Stein. Come back again soon, Kalupasha.
Oh.
Thank you. That's very, very kind. And
Yeah.
I'm really delighted to be having this time together.
Yeah.
And a little mix of the ending. The ending one was a Greek and a Hebrew word all together. So
Yeah.
you got both in there. I love it.
Yeah.
So
Beautiful.
Scotch. It was supposed to be a Greek and a Hebrew sit down and have a glass of scotch.
that sounds like the beginning of a joke. I
Yeah.
think.
Our-
Priest and a rabbi sit down and have a bottle of scotch.
We usually have a whiskey or scotch of the week.
Whiskey or scotch of the week. So
Very nice.
Our next question, though, comes from Christina. She says, good evening, everyone. Could Rabbi please explain the origins of Messianic Judaism and Humanistic Judaism? Thank you for all of the great sessions.
Great question. And this is where I think the words are really very important. So I've been talking in different ways about belief in the Messiah, belief in a Messianic age. I made the comment that many Orthodox Jews are really driven by their fervor for the Messianic vision. There's an important distinction, though, to what are often going to be called Messianic Jews. So there's a population that they're a little bit different, but for our purposes, I'll say two groups that are very similar, called Messianic Jews or sometimes called Jews for Jesus.
Yes.
And this is, in my opinion, it's a very troubling practice. It blends things together in ways that I think are inappropriate.
And here's another area where we share same concern. The Orthodox faith also finds that very troubling because, again, it's feet in both waters. It's very confusing to us, and we find it inappropriate. So that's another similarity.
And I think it's very much about some of the things we were talking about earlier, that one of the things that defines Judaism, if I use the negative phraseology, one of the things that defines Judaism is we don't believe in Jesus. So for someone who says
the divine Jesus, the person Jesus, yes,
yes,
but
Jesus Christ,
yes,
Jesus
Christ, yes.
So to me, it's actually very simple. If someone believes in Jesus Christ, then they're Christian. They're not Jewish. And to blend those together into this, what sometimes some practices call it Messianic Judaism, some call it Jews for Jesus, it is a troubling combination of religious practices. I say have integrity in your beliefs. If you believe in Jesus, then identify yourself as such.
Right.
The question about humanistic Judaism, so the biggest Jewish group in the world is actually secular Jews who are not religious in any way. They're cultural in their identity and in their lives. There is a group, and it's a great question, I'm glad, because it allows for a little bit of a fuller picture, about this phenomenon called humanistic Judaism. And we have an active humanist Jewish congregation in Rochester that really does great things in the community. Humanist Judaism is, and this is going to sound a little bit odd, they're a group that is humanist, meaning they don't believe in God. They don't use God language, but they are religious Judaism. So one of the things they'll do in practical terms is they have written their own prayer book that includes prayers, but rewrites the prayers to take out the God language. So it'll use, what I might call euphemisms. So we may offer a prayer to the source of life or the source of peace, but they won't use God language.
But for Orthodox Christians, and even it's in the Greek word, proskinesis, prayer has to have a direction. It can't be directionless, or it's not prayer. It's a speech.
And it is one, I would say, one of the, even as a progressive, it's yes, absolutely. It is, even though it's in many senses similar in terms of progressive, it's not a practice that is wholly compatible with Reform Judaism.
I meant, I used the term proskinesis, I'm sorry, it's prosephi. Efhi is a prayer, and the what is it, the beginning of the word, what's that called?
Prefix.
The prefix of the word pros is towards. It must be towards something. Okay.
Are you done with that part of the conversation? Or are we all set? Okay. Forgive me if I asked this one already. Did I already ask a question from Diane, or did I not?
Diane always has a lot of great questions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Diane's question kind of relates, I think, maybe to what you're talking about. But do you think the Talmudic Balaam is intended to be the personification of Jesus Christ? I hope I am saying that correctly. Talmudic, Balaam.
I'm actually not sure what she's referencing. Balaam is a figure in the 5 books of Moses.
Okay.
There's the episode in the book of Numbers of a king named Balak who hires a prophet named Balaam to curse the Jewish people, to curse the Israelites. And it's this very colorful episode where God turns Balaam's words from a curse into a blessing. So Balak the king hires Balaam, says, I want you to go out and I want you to curse the people. And Balaam tries to utter the curse, and God turns it into a blessing. And it's actually a verse that is ultimately, many centuries later, then turned into one of the opening prayers in the synagogue service.
Wow. Okay.
So I'm not sure offhand. There very well may be a Talmud passage that elaborates on the story of Balaam, but Balaam is, as I said, a figure in the book of Numbers in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible.
And
And
he
I'm
wouldn't
not,
be equivalent to a Jesus figure.
No, he's a professional blesser. And so Balak, who's a foreign king, wants to curse the Israelites. And so, I suppose the modern equivalent would be go on Google and say, where can I find a cursor? So.
Now I have some questions that I came up during your guys' very enlightening discussion. But the first one I have is kind of basic. For someone who's never been inside of a temple or ever visited a Judaic service before of any sort, what could I expect on my first visit as an observer?
So we welcome visitors, and I think you'd feel right at home. The visiting a synagogue, I mean, there's different architecture, but visiting a synagogue, you would find a sort of auditorium-style setting, rows of seats and an elevated platform in the front. Generally speaking, there are no assigned seats. If you do go to an Orthodox Jewish synagogue, there will generally be separate seating for men and women. So you'd have to figure out which side was
oh no,
appropriate.
now I know you're lying. Because if you take one of the old lady's seats and you're sitting in there that
Well,
she
okay.
sat in for 20 years, there's
Absolutely,
assigned seating.
okay.
Okay,
Yes,
let's be clear here.
There's that kind of assigned seating, but sit in the front, sit in the back.
Right.
The only difference I would say, again, if you visit an Orthodox Jewish synagogue, is separate seating, men and women. There'll be prayer books either handed out at the door or sitting in the pews that will, generally speaking, again, if you're in a Reform setting, they'll have the Hebrew letters, the transliteration, and the English translation.
Okay.
Orthodox prayer books will often, they'll either not have the English or will certainly not have the transliteration. It's not 100% consistent. So if someone visits, it's just like visiting any place, find out what time the worship service is, come a few minutes before to be respectful. We generally dress nicely, but there's no dress code. And then as one enters, there are head coverings available. That is not a sign of identification, more it's a sign of respect for the setting. Certainly I can't speak to whether that would be something that you would advise against or counsel against as participating versus observing. But
No, it's done out of respect,
It's-
right? Now,
it
is
is-
that men and women?
in an Orthodox setting, it is done just by men. In a Reform setting, it is done by either. It is not required of either, but it is frequently done and done by both. So,
Okay, all
but that's, take one of those, and then, beyond there, it's sort of specific to the occasion. And I would say the other piece is, to call ahead and say, I'd like to come to a service. I'll be there this Friday night. What can I expect? Or when would be a good service for me to visit? That kind of a thing. So,
Are there any Americanizations to be found in the synagogues here in the States? Like, for instance, for the Greek Orthodox Church, over here we have, as you see, pews. You won't find the pews.
Pews
in
are very
Greece.
alien
This
to
is
us.
Clearly an Americanization that's typical in churches here.
absolutely. So there's a lot of local culture in terms of the architecture. Actually, if you travel around the world, many of the synagogues that have their roots in the Spanish and Portuguese tradition will be in the round, whereas it's the Ashkenazi or European tradition that is this, rows of seats with a pulpit in the front. Many Reformed synagogues were modeled after Protestant churches, actually, in their roots in 19th century Germany. And so they will feel, big stained glass windows or vaulted ceilings. Then you'll have some that are very, very simple. So there's a lot of local culture, not just in America, but anywhere. But even within Rochester, you'll have synagogues that feel very different one to the other.
Now, whereas the Orthodox Church is huge on iconography. I don't think that there's statues or iconography. Or
Correct.
pictures.
One of the understandings of the Ten Commandments is we're not to make images of God. So generally speaking, what that means is synagogue art and architecture will not have human figures.
Okay.
Sometimes you'll see it where it's very clearly representing biblical characters and can't be mistaken for God, or maybe it's on the sides but not on the pulpit. But the dominant Jewish tradition is not to have human figures out of this interpretation of not making images that could be turned into objects of worship.
Worship, got it. Okay.
Oh, that's another similarity, though. We don't. To us, it's heretical to have an icon of God the Father.
Yes, right. So, right, of God the Father, we cannot have any icons. That's correct.
Right, and it's interesting because if you our ark, where the scrolls are kept in the front of our sanctuary, actually does have a couple of human figures in it. And I think the artist's idea was clearly these are human figures and not God. So it's exactly what you said, which is that no one's turning the people into objects of worship. Judaism just takes that a step further and says we should avoid it for any possibility that
Just in case
somebody
right,
might mistake it for
Right.
the focal point. So.
The next question I have might be kind of silly. Is there a conceptualization of sin in Judaism? If so, is there an idea of original versus inherited sin? Is there confession? What is sin?
That was one of the questions I forgot to ask.
Great.
It's how Judaism sees sin.
It's a great question. So sin in Judaism is really focused on our individual choices and actions. So sin, in a sense, can be defined as violating a commandment. And the goal is for us to be faithful in observing the commandments, do the things that say thou shalt, and don't do the things that say thou shalt not. And there's no concept of original sin or inherited sin. The idea is we are born completely pure, and then further it's developed that each one of us is created with both a good inclination and an evil inclination within us. And that ties back to the Hebrew in the story of creation, where there are two different verbs used for the act of creation. And so the idea develops
Tohu
that,
Rabohu, is that the one?
no, it's Yotzer, Voreu Yotzer.
Okay, all right.
So Tohu and Vohu is chaos. And
Chaos, that's
unformed and
right.
formed.
That's right.
So the idea of sin is we are born pure, but each one of us has the ability every minute of our lives to make a choice that answers our good inclination or our evil inclination. And so you can, it can be a dramatic thing or it can be a small thing, right? I mean, I can use my hand, as a fist, or I can use my hand as a loving stroke. I can, if it's more ritual kind of things, I can choose to eat the kosher food, or I can choose to eat the non-kosher food. I can commit acts like stealing and cheating, or I can give acts of charity. So every moment of our lives, we're encouraged to answer the good inclination, and then the rabbis add to that and say, I would use the word momentum. The more good acts you perform, the more you're good on that path. And so you should do more and more. And then if you commit a wrongdoing, then there are abundant teachings about making up for that. You apologize, you make up for it, and then most importantly, the next opportunity you have to do the right thing, not the wrong thing.
Okay, all right.
So.
Ah, nice. Another question I have might also be silly, but like how in Catholicism they have the Pope. Here we have patriarchs like Patriarch Bartholomew,
Right, or a local bishop.
or a local bishop, or patriarchs of a metropolis. Is there a patriarch or matriarch in Judaism?
No, so Judaism is completely non-hierarchical. There are organizations, so like there's a national body for Reform Judaism that has a president, but they don't function as a patriarch or a bishop or a pope. It is non-hierarchical and non-centralized, which means everything is based on two things. Number one is local authority. So having been elected as the senior rabbi of my synagogue, I have the authority within my synagogue, but the other is very much the individual has the authority. So the dynamic really is that each individual has the authority to make their own choices and decisions, but they're counseled that they should do so with expert advice.
Okay.
Which leads, in an ideal sense, to consulting with their rabbi. So we're in Passover. How do you observe Passover? Each individual can observe Passover, but sounds sort of silly maybe, they should get it right, which means they should make sure they either have the knowledge or they consult someone who has the knowledge. Rabbi, the word rabbi just means teacher, and we ultimately are only leaders because of our knowledge, our expertise, somewhat, I suppose, with charisma, but there's no theological or religious authority that comes from the title of rabbi. Anybody who has whatever learning is able to do that, lead a prayer, lead an entire worship service. Even things like conversion technically are not only done by rabbis, they're done by people who have the expertise in that area. Practically speaking, in most communities, the ones who have the expertise are the rabbis. So it becomes a little bit cyclical.
Now, has that changed? I mean, when the term rabbi in Jesus' time, authority, function, purpose, responsibility, is that equal to the term rabbi today? Has there been any evolution in that term?
So I would say even in the time of Jesus, when the beginning of the leaders called rabbis, even then it was very much this idea of teacher, that one became a rabbi because of their learning. And this, to a certain extent, probably gets to the theology behind Jesus, the difference between Judaism and Christianity, which is, Jesus became a rabbi, and I would say became a rabbi because of his learning, because of his abilities, whereas you might say Jesus became a rabbi because God sent him.
Right.
So, but no, the word, and that's where it's decentralized, non-hierarchical. Rabbi is simply the expert.
Okay.
So then, how do rabbis attain this knowledge? Like, is there schooling you have to go through? Are you elected democratically to become a rabbi? Like, how does it work?
So the path to ordination as a rabbi is an educational one. There are spiritual elements, of course, there are emotional elements, of course, but essentially it's a course of training, typically several stages of training. In Reform Judaism, as an example, our seminary is a 5-year graduate level program. So in order to be accepted at a minimum, you have to be a college graduate and then apply in terms of personal qualities and so on.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then 5 years of study. For us, it's part of that time living in Jerusalem and part of that time in the States. And then there's a ordination ceremony. It's really similar to a academic graduation ceremony. And the idea is one is ordained by someone who's already ordained.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So after you complete your studies, and in an institutional sense, who's it going to be? It's going to be the president or the provost of the seminary. So let's say you're the leader of the rabbinical school.
Mm-hmm.
I go through my course of study. The ordination moment is you ordaining me and saying, based on my knowledge and expertise, I'm granting you the title of rabbi since you've acquired a sufficient level of knowledge and expertise. In Orthodox Judaism, it's a little more nuanced because there are levels of ordination. So someone who is simply going to become a teacher versus someone who's going to become a judge in more complex legal situations. My ordination sort of covers both aspects of that.
Okay, and there's another difference too, because as all priest candidates must go through a seminary and a theological school, the graduation from that school in no way links to your ordination. So you can graduate from that school, you can obtain the expertise, but it is then the hierarch or the bishop that says based on the quality of your character and based on whether or not. So
Right. It's another way to put it. It's an important distinction. I know from studying with some especially Protestant colleagues and friends. Ordination is granted by the seminary, by the school, and you are fully, have that title of rabbi. It then becomes very practical, which is where are you going to serve? Where are you going to work? And then it really is you can call it a search process, a placement process. The congregation will engage you or elect you as their rabbi, but you're already ordained. There's no, I know in some traditions where the ordination is actually given by the church that has called that
Yes, right.
seminarian or that new graduate.
yes,
Or our ordination comes from our seminary. And then, we may never work a day in our lives as a rabbi, or we may, in, a short period of time, be chosen as the rabbi of a congregation. And then, I'll state sort of the obvious, which is everybody I know, and I've learned it more and more every year, is that you're given the title of rabbi, but then you really learn how to be a rabbi through your service. When I think about what I knew and didn't know at the time of my ordination, 22 years ago, believe me, you become a rabbi when you are in relationship with the people who have elected you to serve.
Right. Well, being ordained a priest and being a priest are two radically different things.
Correct.
I would
Yes.
100% agree with that.
So on this show, Father Angelo and Demos really love to talk movies. So for the last question of this evening, I would like to ask both of you what your favorite movies are, and then also what is a really good movie you would recommend people watch that showcases Judaism?
Well, I was thinking it was the Ten Commandments. I mean, if you want to start somewhere, I mean, I would say, again, from an Orthodox Christian perspective, I would say start with that movie, But then you want to know my favorite movie. Well, it's Bond movies, but that has nothing to do with our discussion here. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Rabbi Stein.
It's a great question. Okay, the personal answer, Forrest Gump is my favorite movie. I love Forrest Gump. There are a number of others that I really like, but that's one that I keep coming back to over and over again. That's not a serious answer, but
yeah, right.
So when I think about Jewish movies or films or even TV, they really fall into different categories because there are a number of Jewish movies that paint great pictures of Jewish culture, Jewish communities. I mean, on the very serious side, a movie like Schindler's List,
Okay.
right, is a very, very important movie. It's a very valuable way to learn about the Holocaust, which was one of the most defining events in Jewish history and in world history. So that's sort of one piece, but that's not really teaching about religious Judaism. There are a number of movies that, are set in different Jewish communities. Trying to think of a title or two, but they're ones that are they're set in different communities. The other answer I would give though is there's actually today there are an incredible number of Israeli shows that are available on platforms like Netflix that with translation, subtitles into English, that can give great insight into not only modern Israel, or if they're set further back, but also into the different segments of the society. It's one of the most fascinating things to see shows that are, talking about, set in a secular community, shows that are set in an ultra-Orthodox community. There's one that's all the rage right now called Shtisel, which is set in an ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem that nobody would ever have any way to see inside of, and this really brings it to life in a very faithful way. So it's a lot of it. I'm not coming up with other specific names, but it's really Jewish culture versus religious Judaism and so on.
Well, and what about the one movie that brings Judaism and Orthodox Christianity together, Fiddler on the Roof, right? Because there was an Orthodox priest in the movie,
I was
right?
waiting for that.
Yeah, Fiddler on the Roof certainly is a great, it's a classic, in different ways.
It's a tradition.
Tradition, I mean, it's, there was a movie a number of years ago called Keeping the Faith, which is a lot of fun. It's not a serious movie, but it also talks about Jews and non-Jews coming together in a progressive way. That's sort of a fun movie.
Which one was that again? Say that.
It's called Keeping the Faith.
Keeping the Faith. Okay.
It's about a Reformed rabbi, essentially, and a non-Jew, and they have a relationship and all this. And there's a gospel song that breaks out at the end in the synagogue. And there are others as well. So. Yeah.
All right.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I think this is the end of the show. We really want to thank you, Rabbi Stein, for spending your evening with
Delighted
us.
to be here. Thank you so much. And hopefully the conversations will continue.
Yeah, this was awesome.
Absolutely. I mean, like I said, we're kind of breaking a little bit of new ground, but Demos always wants us exploring new things. And especially at this time, I thought that it would be an interesting discussion to help us learn, like I said, a little bit about not only Judaism, but also kind of the relationship that we personally have here in the Rochester area.
Absolutely. No, it's very important to me. And if it sparks other questions or interest or any other kind of visiting, we're blessed on the clergy level that we have some very good opportunities, and hopefully we'll keep expanding.
So again, Rabbi Stein, thank you very, very much. And
Thank you so much.
And blessings to your congregation. And I look forward to us meeting again when we're all vaccinated, right?
Yes, absolutely. No, thank you so much, and blessings for your holy days that are coming.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.